Hi, good morning everyone again, and thank you for joining us for Cordium's webinar on vendor and third-party risk management. I'm Michael Corcione, Managing Director of Cordium's Cybersecurity and Data Protection Services. Joining me on today's discussion is my colleague Richard Hudson. Good morning, Richard.
Hi, good morning everyone. Thanks, Mike.
Great, and appreciate Richard joining. Richard brings to us over 20 years experience dealing specifically with regulators, functioning as an information security officer in the financial security space for over 20 plus years. So we appreciate everyone's time. I do want to point out on the panel there is a section where you can enter questions. We will look to answer some during the broadcast, but probably mostly we'll address all the questions at the end. So with that being said, we'll move on to today's discussion. So as you see the scary guy on the screen there, it definitely has become a little bit more of a scary topic today, dealing with vendor and third-party risk management. And what we're looking at in this category is something that's been around a while, but has definitely become more of a focus under the regulators as they are realizing how much sharing of data and information firms are doing with vendors and third parties, whether the vendor and third party are storing the information or may even have direct access into the firm's network. So it is a heightened area, and from a cybersecurity perspective, the area where Rich and I do a lot of our activity helping the clients, it's a heightened area of risk just because you have limited insight on the controls. So what we'll go through today is we'll talk about some of the policy work that firms should have behind there. Rich will definitely share some of his experiences dealing with the regulators, what they are looking for specifically, i.e. what does good look like from a perspective of third-party and vendor risk management. Rich, as I mentioned, your experience dealing with the regulators and seeing the trend, especially in recent years and even months, how they've gotten more aggressive on this topic. Just before we start going into some of the additional slides, thoughts on how you've seen firms approach it in the past, and I guess more importantly maybe how the regulators have increased their scrutiny in this area.
Yeah, sure. I've definitely worked with and spoken to several regulators on this issue, and I've actually been examined by regulators on this issue. The main thing for the regulators is that the firm is ultimately responsible for what the vendors do with regards to their data. So it's not a case where the firms will say, oh, my vendor is taking care of it. The regulators are looking for firms to be fully engaged and responsible and accountable for what that vendor does with their information.
Great, thanks, Rich. And that brings to mind to me, which is posted on the SEC's website, is an enforcement action they handed out in late 2015 to an advisor out of the Midwest who essentially was handed down a $75,000 fine, and the occurrence that got them the penalty was they entrusted client information with a cloud provider and basically didn't do sufficient due diligence to ensure the cloud provider had proper information security policies and procedures. So once again, as Rich said, it is you, the responsible owner of that client data, and your responsibility to make sure where you're putting it is protected. So it's an area the SEC is definitely taken serious. Coming into the next slide here, we're going to talk about some of the key points and what really helps build that solid foundation for a strong third-party and vendor risk management program. So initially you need to start and adopt a process, and that's outlined in a policy. And through your policy you want to make sure you're going through a comprehensive risk management and certain risk ranking processes. And how that's lined out in your policy and you follow it really is going to drive by the risk category that you'll place the vendor in, and a lot of that starts with data. So who owns your data, who touches your data. Rich, I know writing third-party and vendor risk management policies is something that you've been doing for many years, and I think a lot more so in the last few months. Tell us some of the aspects of what you're putting into policies that you're writing for clients and the guidance that you're helping them in coaching them in identifying the risk categories for their vendors.
Yeah, sure. Basically, as you have on the slide, One of the key things here is to make sure that there's a clear process of how you go about your due diligence with vendors. And it's not just the due diligence, but to make sure that there is the next step. You know, you did your homework, you got the vendor in place, but there has to be also ongoing review of that vendor security practices, and you document the process around that. And it's a cycle. You know, not because you have the vendor in place and they're doing their contracted work, but there's an ongoing review to make sure that that vendor doesn't slip in their security posture, which could impact your firm. So all those should be documented and very clear, so that if an examiner comes in and says, explain or show me or provide your documentation on how you manage vendors, they should be able to read it and understand very clearly that this is what you actually do. And in turn, there should be also evidence to support what you have documented. So it's very important to outline the process from the due diligence planning phase all the way to implementation. And ultimately, if you no longer need that vendor, all that has to be documented very clearly and followed through.
It's a great point, Rich, about the ongoing aspect, because you know what we see, especially in technology and focused a lot in the cyberspace, is vendors are continually expanding the services they offer, and so the scope changes, and that may give them, you know, greater liberties over your data. So identifying when scope has changed, how it's impacted the risk of the vendor, you know, definitely is something a firm has to stay on top of it. I would expect all our investment management clients on the line today would probably relate that to very similar when an investment manager strays from his investment strategy. And so that would call out for additional due diligence and, you know, more scrutiny. And so how that risk evolves. Definitely part of the process that you want to make sure you're keeping updated on your vendors. And so where we had on the previous slide, and we talked a lot really around the planning and how you're going through a good part of doing the review of a vendor is really getting an understanding of what the business is from a risk category in two elements. One is going to be the business risk of the organization. So if the firm is a large financial institution that's been around for dozens and dozens of years, they are very mature in their operations, your business risk may be relatively low. If it is a newer firm, an emerging product, firm that has not been in business too long, that risk will go higher. The other category where you blend out what I mentioned is on the product side. Same thing if it's a mature product, an order management system that's been around for 15, 20 years, hasn't had many upgrade changes, you know that's a pretty mature product and the risk is low. If it's a very new product on the marketplace and you may even be a beta tester, then that's really going to raise it on the risk category. So blending these two elements in the planning stage will help produce that risk score that will properly put that vendor in a category of high, medium, or low. And then based on how you've laid out the planning around the review process, you'll then know what category and what level of due diligence. I think one of the other areas we look at, Rich, when we talk about vendor due diligence and the planning, and we look at the legal aspect, the customer interactions, is really to understand when reviewing a vendor, there's more than one person in the organization that may need to opine on this review, i.e., and to get your thoughts on legal. We're looking at some of the areas in the contracts, and even more importantly too is teeing up your IT team in advance and making sure that they are aware of what may be impacted on their systems in place and even what tasks may be required from an implementation. But Rich, just share with your experience, you know, where you've seen, I guess, you know, pitfalls where people haven't brought everybody involved that needs to be, and probably even some of the success stories.
Yeah, one of the most important things that needs to be done, and where I see a lot of issues, is bringing in security at the very end. So in the planning stage, when you're looking at vendors, especially if you're looking at the cloud solution, you have to make sure that the security team is brought into the picture early in the process. Even if, as Mike said, the IT folks may not need to do anything immediately, but they'll have questions that the vendor likely will be able to answer. So one of the issues I've seen during planning, the general counsel is involved, maybe compliance, business, the sponsor of the product or service, but definitely the security team has to be brought in early in the process to give their opinion on whether or not that vendor, their service, their connectivity, their controls are in line with what the firm expects.
Great. I guess one good tip I can give here, Rich, on the planning side, especially if firms are in the early stages of really evolving their third-party and vendor risk management program, is you got to start with the vendor inventory. And a good place to start and get your vendor inventory is, I always say, go to accounting and have them pull a listing of the accounts payable, and then also really the accounts receivable, because you have to consider your risk for third parties that you may be extending services to that may have bad credit that could cause you to have some bad debts coming across the book. So you start with those two lists, you look at the dollar figures, usually then now help you categorize them into that high, medium, and low risk. And then of course, and probably even more of a priority, maybe around that data that they hold. So taking your most sensitive data in the organization, which is probably that personally identifiable information, and those that touch or have access or store that information in any capacity would also go in that higher risk category. So a good tip there for getting starting on the planning process. And then we come in really and now look at the specific due diligence that you need to do before going through the exercise. And Rich, we look down here at strategy and goals, legal, financial condition, business experience, reputation, all these elements here form. And a lot of this, firms come to us and ask around what type of documentation, how do you review this? So a couple points. We know that we've heard from clients is, where do I get a DDQ, that due diligence questionnaire, and what can I provide to my vendors so they can give me information back? And this has been a pain point in the industry for the last few years, is trying to find that common or golden copy of a due diligence questionnaire. And what we've been telling clients these days, you're taking the proactive approach, but the vendor should already be in mode, and this is kind of that view of their level of maturity, that they've responded to these questions before. And so the expectation should be that you can request from them in today's market a DDQ, and they should be able to send you one already pre-populated that they've worked on internally, and then you can review that and go back to them and ask for those additional questions that may not have been included. The completeness, thoroughness, and detail that they provide in that DDQ that you've asked for them without any coaching will really give you some insight on their program and how well they've been through this process before and how much they've been scrutinized. But Rich, there's other documents like SOC 2s, SSAE 16s. You're going through these types of documents every day. Thoughts on people that exchange documents, when they should ask for, look for, and how you're doing some of those reviews?
Yeah, definitely. One of the key documents to request from the vendor to review their controls is the SSA 16 SOC 2 report. They should have that. If a vendor who is providing you some particular service, especially in the cloud space, does not have a SOC 2 report, that should be a red flag. Definitely, it's something that is completed by an independent audit firm and would give you an insight of their controls, physical and also logical. So that's a key document that should be on the due diligence request list, so to speak, just to make sure that there is an independent review that was done on the vendor by a third party. It's very important.
And so two items also on this, I guess I want to point out, Rich, is, where we talk about the information security, really to expand upon that is you want to get a view of their policies and procedures so that you can understand what they're doing. Right, Rich?
If they have it. We've seen sometimes the vendor's documentation is not fully complete. There are times when the vendor may even say, okay, you can see what we have, but you have to come to our facilities. Definitely, if they have the documentation in place for their security policy, their incident response, business continuity, those things should be requested and reviewed to see how they handle these particular controls.
Yeah, I guess that's a similar pain point to the way we've seen, a lot of clients over the last several years that I've worked with really, evolving and beginning in some cases their own information security policies and procedures. It's very similar on the vendor side, especially newer ones, that they've really refined them, that they've made them more mature, and that they have a process of continually updating them. One of the policies that is one of my favorites that I like to look at on the vendor side and get from them an understanding is the incident response and management. So how are they handling their instances, which is really going to lead into our next slide and talking a little bit more about contract negotiation. So where I mentioned incident response, it is pretty important for you to understand and get a view of how that firm will handle the response to a cyber incident. Very similar around DR and BCP, but cyber gets into a lot more areas around disclosure requirements, legal requirements, how they've remediated and made sure the exercise wouldn't happen before. So where we talk about the contracts, one of the key elements that we see, and I guess, Rich, this goes into your point earlier about that ongoing review. Maybe today you've been working with a vendor for many years. It's a point now where a lot of firms are reviewing contractual language and looking to add in clauses around how that provider will notify you and keep you informed throughout the process if they should have a breach of your data. So Rich, I know this is an area, as you like to well zone in on quite a bit. Some thoughts, and really let's take an example. I know actually we had a client recently that reported to us they had a third party they were dealing with that had a breach, and they really weren't sure how to react. And so obviously going through that exercise beforehand, you'd have a little bit in place, but share with them just some thoughts on that incident response category with the third party or vendor.
Yeah, definitely. And, just to add to what Mike said in terms of an example, I know of a particular case where a firm, the head of HR had authority to sign off contracts with vendors that supported the HR process. And this particular vendor, the contract stated that if there was a breach, then they would not be liable and still expected to be paid. And the head of HR signed it without first consulting with the security team, IT, or even the general counsel. So, the contractual language, especially when it comes to security and protecting your information, is very important to review and have the right people review it, because once it's signed, it's more or less binding. So it's very important to make sure that the suggestions that we have on this particular page are considered very seriously, because once you sign a dotted line, you're going to be held accountable and tied to it. And in the legal process, if there is an issue, the vendor may not be liable for any particular incident. So that has to be really reviewed carefully.
Definitely a real key emphasis, as everybody knows, in every contract negotiation, whether you're using in-house counsel or a combination of them and outside counsel, definitely want to get those contracts reviewed, but really have the lens put in there for the advanced types of cyber threats and response notifications that would be required today going through. And of course, all the applicable laws around, how and when you need to disclose if there was a breach, understanding then, and the biggest thing on that incident response, I think also too, is, how are they going to respond? Do they have forensics teams? And really assess the completeness of what type of data may have been compromised. Right? So we'll take us into the next topic that we've talked quite a bit about before, but we'll get into a little bit more specifics here around the ongoing monitoring for a vendor. So in addition to the business strategy, the reputation, legal and regulatory requirements, there are additional tools and technologies in today's marketplace. So in all areas of information security that are really evolving, getting more transparent, the regulators really know and understand that firms have the ability to do more these days. So they'll expect you to do more. Not necessarily more on every vendor, but take it once again to that risk-based approach. And where I talk about more and tools and technologies, there are services and solutions out there that will actually allow you to produce a security score for a vendor. And now, once again, this is not an ultimate solution and an end-all. It's a layer of security but there will basically allow you to get a view of their posture based on some of their activity being emitted from their network into the publicly available data on the World Wide Web. And that information can tell you if they've had some data breaches, if they've had some infections, malware, even the type of activity that may be represented by where their users visit on certain websites, and even their patching cadence on their externally facing software certificates. So having that view on a vendor and being able to run it on a daily basis is pretty helpful and can really send you an alert in advance of a decline in a firm's security posture. So Rich, I know this is a tool that you work with almost on a daily basis. We're having a lot of our clients that are asking us to facilitate them with this type of tool. What's your thought in, how the regulators are evolving around this space, but just in general, more of that ongoing monitoring capacity?
Yeah, definitely. The regulators are, well, one of the first things that they require is to make sure that you rank your vendors. By having some type of ranking system, that determines how much ongoing monitoring you have to carry out. If a firm has 20 vendors, not necessarily applying the same review to all 20 vendors is realistic. So by having some type of ranking mechanism, you can then determine what level of review is needed for the vendors. So the examiners, I've experienced it where they've asked to see a list of vendors by rank. And definitely in doing the review process, it's very important to make sure that, for example, in the ongoing, that the vendor isn't going to move his data center to a different country. That leads into a whole different set of issues, cross-border laws and what have you. And they can do it without necessarily informing everyone, all their clients. So ongoing is pretty important. It's not just a check-the-box exercise. Threats change every day, and it's really up to the firms to hold the vendors accountable because they have your information on their servers. And that's what is expected by the regulators, that you can show that you aren't doing these ongoing checks.
Great, definitely, Rich. And so that's going to bring us into our final slide and topic before we go into some questions from the callers on the line, is really the determination of a vendor. So when you have that planning process, that circle that we went through in the beginning, part of that circle is determination. And our investment manager clients on the line would probably relate this to is when you enter a position or investment, the first thing you want to know is when you're going to get out. So you always have to have a plan and an exit strategy, especially on those real critical vendors. So if it's somebody that has a key piece of software or something that's an integral component in any part of your supply chain, from research or order execution or the investment process, anything that could really put a crimp in the day-to-day activities of the organization, you'll have to have an effective and planned out termination strategy. Same as like if you were using an administrator and you needed to change administrators, there's a good portion of time there that you would run parallel. So having an understanding of how long you'd run parallel and what would be the cost implications of making those changes. And so it's a trade-off of having that understanding versus what the downside would be in the loss of revenue if you didn't have that. Looking on the slide that we have up here too, a couple of the highlighted points really when it comes around the termination, that data retention and destruction. So this is actually not only part of the termination process, but also even ongoing. How long are they going to hold your data? What assurances do you get that your data has been destructed? I like the one here too where you're talking about joint intellectual property, reputational risks. I guess one of the other elements around here too is if you're dealing with a collaborative effort on some software or custom application development, who owns the source code? Is it kept in escrow? So Rich, you've fired many, many vendors in your day and have been through this process and, making it as painless as possible. Any few thoughts here that you can share with our listeners today?
Yeah, sure. One of the things to remember with this, again, is especially from a legal perspective, is if they have your data on their servers in their environment, to make sure it's fully understood what's going to happen to that data. I'm sure they've backed up that data to their servers, and they may be obligated by law to retain that data. So it's very important that the legal aspect of how you manage that is very clear. Because, for example, if there is a legal issue and there's a subpoena and they have the data, it has to be provided. So it's very important to have all those things ironed out by the legal folks. The vendors typically are expecting, or this should be in the contracts. It's just one of the protections that all contracts should have for firms. And based on discussions with the vendor, it should be fully agreed as to what the potential exit strategy would be. The firm could be acquired by another firm. So definitely, there could be certain aspects that need to be looked at in anticipating those particular conditions.
Great. Thanks, Rich.
Sure.
Well, that does come towards the end of our slides for today, but we do want to check and see if we have any questions that have come across. So give me one moment and take a look. So the first question we have is, when you talk about the ongoing review for clients, is, how often do you conduct those reviews? Rich, I think this comes down to that risk-based discussion, right?
Exactly. So if you have done your due diligence and you have your process in place, you should have been able to rank your vendors, typically high, medium, low. And the review process for the higher ones would be more frequent than, let's say, medium or low. But the regulators do expect that all vendors will have some level of ongoing review. The frequency will be much more for the higher ones than the lower ones. And that really comes down to the firm's security posture and decision on how frequent that would be. It's not really set in stone by the regulators, but the firms will have to show in their process the frequency of how they do the ongoing review.
Great. So next question we have here, actually looks like it's two parts in two questions. So first is, we mentioned a vendor and third-party risk management policy. What are the regulators looking for specifically? Is what I have in my written information security plan sufficient? So what you have in the plan being sufficient or not is hard to tell based on this, but I will tell you from what we've reviewed and have seen in clients, it usually is not. And what the regulators are looking for is a separate document. We do have two clients actually in the last 6 months that have received a deficiency notice during an SEC sweep exam for not having a dedicated third-party vendor risk management policy. So it's more complex. You're going to have more of those policies and procedures laid out. Rich, we talked a couple points about it earlier, but what's some of those content? I know, high level you're laying out all the categories, but it really comes down to those key components of how you're categorizing the vendors, right?
Yeah, definitely. There has to be, and we've seen it, the security policies and programs may include a paragraph or two on how vendors are managed or third parties. It has to be separate. There's so many things that need to be done that should be documented in a different document. If someone requests of a firm to provide their vendor policy or vendor process, the security policy should not be the document provided, because it's going to have more information than what was requested. The points that are very important in the security space for the vendors is the planning. A lot goes into how you select vendors, the background checking, their financial condition. It's very important before you actually begin to work with a vendor that you put up front the requirements of the vendor selection process. And then once you do that, how you ongoing will check their service and security posture. Ranking, again, is very important. You have to make sure that you have a clear mechanism to rate or rank your vendors. The regulators will ask for that. They will want to see that you have a ranking mechanism. So you can tell these are your high vendors or critical vendors, these are your medium, middle tier vendors, and your low risk vendors. And then they'll want to see that you have a process to show that you're following your documentation. So definitely there's a whole lot more than a couple of paragraphs that goes into managing vendors, and it has to be a separate document.
So Rich, you said there a couple times, see the process and show the regulators, which leads to a question that came in during the webinar, but I left it towards the end because it does tee up very nicely for the webinar we're having next week on our compliance testing and tracking, which is how do you manage this process? So traditional spreadsheets has been, the method for many years, but now what the requirement calls for when the regulators come in is a lot more than just showing a workflow in a spreadsheet. There are a lot of documents and artifacts that you need to keep archived and pretty handy for showing the regulators. So going through a tool that allows you to create a workflow, that allows you to pen the documents. So this way, even if you have a transition of staff within the organization, somebody else can look through and see what was done in the past. It can generate tasks and reminders for when you need to get the updated annual SOC 2 from the firm. So that SEC sweep exam letter that goes out for the cybersecurity review has a whole category on vendor and third-party risk management and a whole bunch of documents that they're looking for, not only in regards to your policies and procedures, but then they're going to want to see how you've applied those during your review process, which leads to a lot more documents that come from the vendors that need to be kept securely, not necessarily available on a SharePoint drive, and in a fashion that will also have the ability to, like I said, generate those alerts and reminders when you need to do those reviews. So, Rich, you've faced the regulators many times. You always profess you've never been written up by a regulator in 20 years. And so what's helped you over the years appease what they're looking for?
Yeah, it definitely comes to preparation and a lot of planning. The key thing that the regulators are looking for in the vendor risk management space is that you have a clear process that's documented and you follow it. If you don't have it documented, but you're doing something in practice, that's still going to be an issue. So the main thing is that whatever you're doing, if it's working, it should be documented and evidenced so that when they come, as Mike said, if you use spreadsheets, that's not going to be accepted. They're definitely looking for a more robust way to manage the vendors. And definitely I've experienced where a firm had a spreadsheet tracking type system that they built internally. There was a couple of people who knew how it worked. They had a policy and procedure. The person who did most of the work left the firm. The new person who came in, there wasn't a good transition. Regulators came in, they got written up. So even though they had something in place, the new individual wasn't able to explain it. So it's very important to make sure that if you have a process, it's documented. It's easier to manage by not having a few people understand how it works. As we said earlier, there are more people who need to be involved in the process. And that way it's easier to explain to the regulators if they come in. So it's not a silo effort. It has to be an organizational understanding of how vendors should be managed.
Great, great. Thanks, Rich.
Sure.
So that does conclude the questions that we had submitted, but we welcome any follow-up questions and inquiries. We can be reached at cyberinfo@cordium.com. Additionally, our team will be sending some follow-up emails out, and this presentation will be made available online for further viewing afterwards. We thank you again for today's attendance and also welcome you to join our webinar next Wednesday on the policy compliance controls testing and tracking. So not only on the vendor risk management component, but over your entire information security program, as well as other compliance areas. And we look forward to sharing with you next week some guidance and thoughts in that area, as well as a preview to our pilot software solution that will help you manage those tasks. Thank you, everyone, for your time today. We look forward to having you join our webinars in the future.
Thank you.